Have you ever wondered what silence sounds like when it's 30 degrees below zero? Or how it feels to drift towards sleep knowing the wind outside could collapse your shelter before morning? Tonight, we're stepping back to a time when simply closing your eyes for rest was an act of quiet courage. When the Wild West froze over, survival wasn't just about food and fire, it was about the fragile, precious art of sleep itself. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the frontier, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Imagine yourself standing on the Wyoming plains in January of 1872. The sky is colorless, a pale sheet, stretched thin between earth and heaven. Snow has been falling for 3 days straight, soft at first, then driven sideways by winds that seem to come from somewhere beyond the horizon. You are miles from the nearest town. Your cabin, if you can call it that, is a collection of rough-hewn logs chinked with whatever mud and moss you could gather before the ground froze solid. Tonight, like every winter night out here, your only goal is simple: to sleep, to rest your aching body, to wake again when morning light filters through the gaps in your walls. But sleep, in this place, in this time, is never simple. The rhythm of your days on the frontier follows the sun with ruthless consistency. You rise before dawn because there is no choice. The fire has died to embers during the night, and if you don't stoke it soon, the cold will creep into your bones so deeply that even movement becomes painful. Your breath hangs visible in the air inside your cabin. The single room you call home has frosted over on the inside of the walls, delicate patterns of ice climbing the rough wood like winter's own decoration. Your boots are where you left them near the hearth, stiff with cold despite your best efforts. You have to warm them before your feet will fit inside. The leather has gone rigid overnight, frozen solid, and you know from experience that forcing your feet into frozen boots invites frostbite. So you wait, crouched by the fire you're coaxing back to life, feeding it kindling one small piece at a time because firewood is precious and running low. This is how every day begins. And this is the memory you carry with you through all your waking hours, the knowledge that tonight you will have to do it all over again, that before you can rest, you must prepare, that sleep itself has become work. Let us walk through what it means to seek rest in the frozen heart of the Wild West winter. Your cabin sits on a small claim in Montana territory, though it could just as easily be Dakota, Wyoming, or the high country of Colorado. The walls are logs, yes, but they were cut in haste during the brief building season, and they've settled unevenly. Gaps have opened between them, some as wide as your finger, and though you packed them with mud, moss, old rags, and even pages torn from the few books you owned, the wind still finds its way through. At night, lying on your narrow bed, you can feel the draft moving across your face like cold fingers exploring in the dark. The roof is layers of sod laid over rough planking. When it rains or snows, the sod grows heavy. Sometimes you wake to the sound of water dripping in the corners. Sometimes small chunks of frozen earth fall onto your quilt. In the deepest cold, the entire roof freezes into a solid mass, which should be good, except that it also means any warmth from your fire rises up and melts the underside, just enough to create a perpetual state of dampness overhead. You have one window, It has no glass. Glass is expensive and far away, so you've covered the opening with oiled paper stretched over a frame. During the day, it lets in a pale, watery light. At night, it's just another place for the cold to seep in, so you've hung a scrap of canvas over it, adding one more layer between you and the killing cold outside. Your bed is not what people from the eastern cities would recognize as a bed. It's a simple wooden frame, ropes strung across it in a grid, and on top of that, a thin mattress stuffed with prairie grass and straw. You gathered the grass yourself last summer, back when the world was warm, and that seemed like a problem for a distant future. Now, lying on it night after night, you feel every stem, every stalk. The straw has compressed under your weight, offering less cushioning than you'd hoped. Beneath it all, beneath the ropes and the frame, is the floor. Rough planks with gaps between them through which the cold earth breathes upward. Some nights, you swear you can feel the cold rising through the floor more intensely than it falls from the ceiling. Your blankets are wool, heavy and thick, but also scratchy and slightly damp. Wool has the miraculous property of keeping you warm, even when wet, which is fortunate, because moisture is constant. Your breath condenses in the air, settles on the blankets, freezes into tiny crystals. By morning, the edges of your coverings are stiff with frost. You also have a buffalo robe, traded from a passing hunter 2 winters ago. It's heavy as sin, smells of old animal and smoke and the tanning process that preserved it, but it holds heat like nothing else. On the worst nights, you pile everything you own on top of yourself: wool blankets, the buffalo robe, your extra clothes, even your coat, and still you feel the cold working its way in. Sleep, you have learned, is less about comfort and more about exhaustion. The process of preparing for sleep begins hours before you actually lie down. As the afternoon light begins to fail, and in winter it fails early, the sun giving up its fight against the cold by 4 o'clock, you begin the careful rationing of your firewood. You have a pile outside under a lean-to you built against the cabin wall, but it's never enough. It's never enough because the trees here are sparse, and what wood you can find is often green or damp, and good dry firewood requires planning. You didn't have time during the brief summer months when you were trying to grow food and make repairs and do all the 100 other things survival demands. So you feed the fire carefully, just enough to keep the chill at bay, just enough to warm the pot of weak broth you're having for supper, dried beans, a bit of salt pork if you're lucky, water melted from snow. You eat slowly, sitting close to the hearth, feeling the heat on your face while your back remains cold. The cabin is too small and too poorly sealed to ever achieve even warmth. There are zones, the zone of heat near the fire and everywhere else. After your meal, you attend to the small tasks that have become ritual. You check the door, making sure it's secured against the wind and against animals that might be drawn by the scent of food or warmth. You've heard wolves howling in the distance most nights, their voices sliding through the darkness like cold water. You check your boots again, positioning them just so near the fire. You lay out tomorrow's clothes, such as they are, hoping the proximity to heat will make them slightly less frigid when you pull them on. You add one more log to the fire, knowing it's probably the last one until morning. You've learned through trial and error how to build a fire that will burn low and slow through the night. Banking the coals, they call it, covering them with ash to slow their consumption while keeping them alive. It's an art. Sometimes you get it right and you wake to embers you can coax back to flame. Sometimes you get it wrong and you wake to cold ashes and the much harder task of starting fresh. And then finally, there is nothing left to do but sleep. You approach your bed and already you can feel how cold it will be. The blankets have been sitting in the ambient temperature of the cabin all day, which means they're cold. Not frozen solid, but cold enough that sliding between them is a shock to your body. Some settlers have learned to heat stones in the fire wrap them in cloth, and place them in the bed to warm it before lying down. You've tried this. The stones work for about an hour. Then they're just heavy, cooling rocks taking up space under your blankets. Still, sometimes you do it anyway, because that first hour of warmth is worth the awkwardness later. You do not undress for bed. The idea of removing your clothes in this cold is absurd. You sleep in your wool shirt, your long underwear, your thick socks. Sometimes you even keep your trousers on. On the coldest nights, you've slept with your coat spread over you as an additional blanket, and your hat pulled down over your ears. Modesty and comfort are luxuries for people who have heat to spare. You lie down, and the cold of the mattress seeps through your clothes immediately. You pull the blankets up, pile them high, and then you do what everyone does. You curl into yourself. You pull your knees up toward your chest. You tuck your hands under your arms or between your thighs. You try to make yourself as small as possible to conserve heat. Your breath frosts in the air above your face, and you pull the blankets up higher until just your nose and eyes are exposed. This is the position you'll maintain, more or less, for the next 8 or 10 hours. The sounds of night on the winter frontier are particular. The wind is constant, a low moan that rises and falls but never quite stops. It finds every gap in your walls, every weakness in your structure, and it whistles through in tones that range from soft whisper to sharp shriek. The cabin itself makes sounds, the wood contracting in the cold, sharp cracks and groans that startle you even though you've heard them 100 times. Sometimes snow slides off the roof with a soft whoomp that makes you wonder if the whole structure is collapsing. And then there are the animal sounds. The wolves, yes, but also coyotes closer than you'd like. The occasional eerie scream of a mountain lion, rare but unmistakable. The skittering of mice in your walls, seeking the same warmth you are. You've made peace with the mice. They're just trying to survive too. Sleep does not come easily. Your body is tired, exhausted really, from the endless labor of frontier life, but your mind resists. There's a low-level anxiety that accompanies every winter night, a awareness that you are vulnerable. The fire could go out, the temperature could drop even further, a storm could blow in, trapping you inside for days. These thoughts circle like the wolves outside, and you have to breathe through them, slow and steady, willing yourself toward rest. Sometimes you share this space. If you're a family, there might be children sleeping in the same room, tucked into corners or sharing pallets on the floor. Married couples sleep together, their combined body heat a precious resource. In the mining camps and cattle towns, in the bunkhouses where workers crowd together during the winter months, men sleep shoulder to shoulder on narrow bunks stacked 2 or 3 high. Privacy is non-existent. The sound of other people breathing, coughing, shifting in the night becomes its own kind of lullaby. Strange, but human. A reminder that you're not alone in the dark. Those who travel alone have it worst. The cowboy bedding down on the open prairie, his horse tied nearby, his bedroll laid on frozen ground. He's built a small fire, cooked his beans, and now he lies down fully clothed, pulling his blanket and slicker over himself, his saddle as a pillow. The ground beneath him is so cold it feels like it's pulling the heat from his body. He'll sleep fitfully, waking every hour or so to check the fire, to listen for threats, to simply confirm that he's still alive. The frontier sleeper learns certain truths that people in warmer places, safer places, never have to learn. Sleep is not rest so much as temporary surrender. Your body demands it, and so you comply, but you never quite let go. You're always partially aware, partially alert. The part of you that listens for danger never fully quiets. And there are real dangers. Frostbite can claim fingers, toes, noses while you sleep if you're not careful. Carbon monoxide from a poorly ventilated fire can kill an entire cabin of people before morning. Hypothermia makes you sleepy even as it's killing you, and the line between sleep and death becomes terrifyingly thin when the temperature drops low enough. You've heard stories of travelers found in the spring, curled in their blankets as if sleeping peacefully, frozen solid. So you monitor yourself even in half-consciousness. Are your feet numb? Can you still feel your hands? Is the cold making you confused, making you want to remove your blankets and clothes? That's a bad sign. That means you need to move, to wake up, to do something. The nights are long in winter. The sun sets early and rises late, leaving 15 or 16 hours of darkness. You can't stay awake for all of it. The candles and lamp oil are too precious to burn for light, and there's nothing to do in the dark anyway except sleep. So you sleep in shifts sometimes, doze for a while, wake up, tend the fire, sleep again. It's fragmented, unsatisfying, but it's enough. It gets you through. Some nights are worse than others. When a true blizzard comes, the wind screams and the cabin shakes, and snow piles up against your door so high you couldn't open it if you tried. Those nights, you simply endure. You keep the fire going as best you can, you stay under your blankets, and you wait. There's nothing else to do. The world outside has become hostile in a way that's almost abstract. It's not malicious, it's just indifferent. And that indifference could kill you as easily as breathing. But here's the strange thing, you do sleep. Despite everything, despite the cold and the discomfort and the fear, your body eventually surrenders. Exhaustion is powerful. After walking through snow all day, after chopping frozen wood, after struggling with frozen water and frozen tools and the 1,000 small battles that make up a winter day on the frontier, your body demands rest. And so you give it, however imperfectly. And when you finally drift off somewhere in those cold hours before dawn, there's a moment, just a moment, when the discomfort fades. When your body's warmth, trapped beneath layers of wool and hide, reaches a kind of equilibrium with the cold. When the sounds of the night become ambient, background, almost soothing in their consistency. When you sink into something that approximates real sleep. Your dreams, when they come, are often of warmth, of summer, of places you left behind, where houses had real walls and real windows and stoves that heated every room. Sometimes you dream of food, of meals you haven't eaten in months. Sometimes you dream of people, faces you miss, voices you'd almost forgotten. And then, always too soon, you wake. The fire is low or dead. The cabin is even colder than when you fell asleep. Your body aches from lying in one position, from the poor support of your makeshift mattress, from the general accumulation of cold in your joints and muscles. But you're alive. You made it through another night. You push back the stiff blankets. You sit up, breath fogging in the frigid air. You reach for your boots, stiff and cold, despite being near the hearth. And you begin again. This is the rhythm of winter sleep on the frontier. Not restful, not comfortable, but sufficient. Enough to keep you going. Enough to see another day. The settlers, the miners, the cowboys, the farmers, they all learned to sleep in the cold. They learned because they had no choice. Sleep was survival, and survival was all that mattered, and so they slept. Poorly, uncomfortably, anxiously. But they slept, night after night, winter after winter, until spring came, finally, mercifully, and the world remembered warmth again. As the fire in our imagined cabin burns lower, let us shift our attention from the common struggle to one particular man, a figure who became legend not despite the cold, but because of how he endured it. His name was Hugh Glass, and his story is woven through with winter nights so brutal they seem impossible, yet every word of it is grounded in the historical record. Picture a man sleeping alone under stars, so cold they seem to crackle in the darkness, Picture him wrapped in the skin of the very beast that tried to kill him, crawling across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness with wounds that should have ended his life. Picture him closing his eyes each night, uncertain if morning would come, yet waking anyway, again and again, driven by something more stubborn than hope. This is not a story of heroism in the traditional sense. It is quieter than that. It is a story about rest, stolen in impossible circumstances, about the body's determination to sleep, even when sleep seems like surrender. Hugh Glass was born around 1783 in Pennsylvania, though the details of his early life blur into the kind of uncertainty that surrounds many frontier figures. What we know is that he lived a life of movement and danger long before the incident that made him famous. He spent time at sea, possibly pressed into service on a pirate vessel. The records are unclear, as they often are for men who lived on the margins of civilization. Later, he was captured by Pawnee people and lived among them for several years, learning their ways, their language, their methods of survival in landscapes that killed unprepared men with casual regularity. By 1823, Glass had found work as a fur trapper and guide, joining Major Andrew Henry's expedition up the Missouri River into what is now South Dakota and Montana. He was around 40 years old by then, which made him practically ancient by frontier standards. Most trappers were young men, expendable and hungry for fortune. But Glass had something the young men lacked: experience. He knew how to read weather, how to find water, how to sleep light and wake fast when danger approached. The fur trapping expeditions of this era were exercises in controlled desperation. Groups of men would push deep into unmapped territories, seeking the beaver pelts that wealthy Europeans craved for their hats. They traveled light, carried minimal supplies, and depended on hunting and foraging to sustain themselves. When winter came, they would establish camps, crude affairs of log and hide, and wait out the worst months huddled around fires that never quite kept the cold at bay. Glass knew this life. He'd spent winters in temporary shelters that were barely shelters at all, lean-tos constructed from branches and buffalo hide, or simply hollow spaces beneath fallen trees where a man could press himself against the trunk and pile snow around the opening to trap what little heat his body produced. He'd slept beside campfires that he had to feed throughout the night, waking every hour or two to add wood, because letting the fire die meant potentially not waking at all. His sleeping arrangements during these expeditions were utilitarian in the extreme. A buffalo robe, if he was lucky, spread on the ground. A blanket, wool or hide, depending on what he'd managed to trade for or carry. His rifle always within reach, because wolves and bears and hostile bands were all possibilities in the night. Sometimes he'd dig a shallow depression in the earth for his body, the depression offering a few inches of protection from wind. Sometimes he'd sleep against his horse for warmth, the animal's body heat more reliable than any fire. The men who traveled with him slept the same way. They'd cluster their bedrolls near the fire in a rough circle, feet pointing toward the flames, each man responsible for his own survival, but drawing comfort from proximity to others. The sounds of men sleeping in the wilderness are particular. The snoring, yes, but also the constant shifting, the periodic waking to check surroundings, the whispered conversations between those who couldn't quite achieve rest. Sleep on the frontier was never private, never fully peaceful. In August of 1823, Glass was scouting ahead of his group near the forks of the Grand River in present-day South Dakota. It was not yet winter, but in these territories cold could come at any time. Glass was moving through dense brush near a stream when he encountered a grizzly bear with cubs, the worst possible combination. The bear attacked with the kind of violence that only a mother protecting her young can muster. What happened next has been documented by those who found him afterward, pieced together from Glass's own later accounts. The bear mauled him savagely. His scalp was torn, his throat laid open, his ribs broken, one leg mangled. The wounds were catastrophic, the kind that should have killed him within minutes. When his companions reached him, they drove the bear off and stared at what they assumed was a dying man. Major Henry, the expedition leader, asked for volunteers to stay with Glass until he died and then bury him properly. 2 men agreed, John Fitzgerald and a young Jim Bridger, who would later become famous in his own right. The deal was they would receive extra pay for performing this grim duty. The rest of the party moved on. Fitzgerald and Bridger waited. 1 day, 2 days. Glass clung to life with a tenacity that must have seemed unnatural. But the territory was dangerous, the possibility of attack by Arikara warriors very real, and the 2 men eventually made a decision. They took Glass's rifle, his knife, his essential equipment, and they left him. Not buried, not dead, just left. When Glass finally regained enough consciousness to understand his situation, he was alone in wilderness, unarmed, unable to walk, with wounds that wept and bled, and would almost certainly become infected, and it was getting cold. This is where his story becomes a story about sleep. Glass could not walk, so he crawled. The nearest fort, Fort Kiowa, was over 200 miles away. He began dragging himself south, following the Cheyenne River. His progress was measured in yards per day at first. The pain must have been extraordinary, but pain eventually becomes just another condition of existence when it's constant enough. But every night he had to sleep. Think about this carefully. Imagine your body broken, your flesh torn open, your bones grinding against each other with every movement. Now imagine finding a place to rest for the night, knowing you have no weapon, no fire, no shelter, knowing that wolves follow the scent of blood and that your blood is everywhere, on your clothes, in your wounds, marking your trail across the prairie. Glass would drag himself to whatever cover he could find. Sometimes it was a cluster of bushes. Sometimes a depression in the land where he'd be slightly less visible. Sometimes nothing at all, just his spot where exhaustion overtook him and he simply stopped moving. He had no blanket. His clothes were whatever he'd been wearing when abandoned, now torn and fouled. So he did what the truly desperate do. He used what was available. He found the carcass of the grizzly bear that had attacked him. His companions had killed it, and he cut away portions of its hide. The thick fur became his blanket, his shelter, his only protection against the elements. At night, wrapped in the skin of the bear that nearly killed him, Glass would lie in the darkness and drift into something that was part sleep, part unconsciousness. His body needed rest to heal, but rest was nearly impossible. The cold was one problem, the pain was another. But worse than both was the vulnerability. He couldn't run, he couldn't fight. He could only lie there and hope nothing found him in the dark. The psychological weight of this is worth considering. Every night might be his last. Every time he closed his eyes might be the final time. And yet he had to close them. The body demands sleep, even in extremity, perhaps especially in extremity, because healing requires rest, and his body was desperately trying to heal. Some nights, coyotes would circle him. He could hear them in the darkness, their yips and howls, the pad of their feet on earth. He'd lie perfectly still, wrapped in his bear hide, and wait for them to decide he was too dangerous or too alive to be worth the risk. Usually they moved on. Sometimes they came close enough that he could smell them, a musky, wild scent mixing with the smell of his own infected wounds. The weather grew colder as he traveled, the nights especially. Frost would form on his makeshift blanket by morning, and he'd wake shivering so hard his teeth rattled, but he'd wake. That's the important part. Against all probability, he kept waking. He survived on whatever he could find or catch. Wild berries, roots dug from the earth with his bare hands. At one point, he witnessed wolves take down a buffalo calf, and after the wolves had eaten their fill and left, he dragged himself to the carcass and fed on what remained. This provided not only food, but material. He cut more hide from the buffalo, layering it with the bear skin to improve his sleeping insulation. As weeks passed and his wounds slowly, impossibly, began to close, Glass's crawling became more efficient. He could cover more ground each day. But the nights remained brutal. The temperature continued to drop as autumn deepened. He was heading into winter with inadequate gear, inadequate shelter, and a body still trying to recover from trauma that should have been fatal. He found the Cheyenne River and followed it, drinking from it, occasionally catching fish with his bare hands. The water was ice-cold, fed by mountain snowmelt, and it chilled him from the inside. But it also meant he wouldn't die of thirst, which was something. At night, he'd sleep near the water when he dared, the sound of it flowing past in the darkness a kind of company. There's a particular loneliness to sleeping alone in vast wilderness that's difficult to articulate to people who've never experienced it. The silence is not really silence. There are always sounds, wind and water and animals, but it's empty of human presence in a way that makes you feel erased. Glass would lie under his hides and stare up at stars so numerous and bright they seemed unreal, and he was the only human being who could see them in that moment, in that place. The only consciousness in all that emptiness. Some historians believe he talked to himself during this time, holding conversations in the darkness to maintain sanity. Others think he prayed, though Glass was not known to be particularly religious. More likely, he simply endured. Humans have a remarkable capacity for endurance when the alternative is death. As his strength returned, Glass was able to build small fires. This changed everything. Fire meant warmth, yes, but it also meant protection. Animals avoid fire. The psychological comfort of light in darkness cannot be overstated. He'd gather whatever dry wood he could find, use flint and steel, tools he'd fashioned or found along the way, and create small blazes that he'd nurse through the night. Sleep came easier with fire. Not easy, never easy, but easier. He also began to encounter other travelers, friendly native people who gave him food and basic supplies. A French trading party who offered him a ride downriver on their keelboat. His journey became less a desperate crawl and more a determined trek. But the nights remained cold, and sleep remained something to be achieved rather than something that simply happened. By the time Glass reached Fort Kiowa in early October, he'd been traveling for 6 weeks. The fort's inhabitants were astonished to see him. They'd heard about the trapper left for dead by his companions, and here he was, walking, barely but walking, into their compound. His wounds had closed into angry scars. His body was emaciated, but he was alive. He slept in a real bed that night, in a room with walls and a roof, under actual blankets, with a fire in a proper fireplace. And according to accounts, he slept for nearly 24 hours straight, his body finally given permission to fully rest, to release the vigilance that had kept him alive through all those frozen nights alone. But Glass's story didn't end there. He was not content to simply survive. He wanted to confront the men who'd abandoned him. So after recovering at Fort Kiowa through the winter, sleeping in relative warmth and safety, eating regular meals, healing in ways he couldn't while crawling across the wilderness, he set out again in the spring. He traveled to Fort Henry, then to Fort Atkinson, tracking down Fitzgerald and Bridger. When he found Bridger, he chose mercy. The boy had been young and likely coerced by the older Fitzgerald. But he never found Fitzgerald to exact whatever revenge he'd imagined, and eventually Glass let it go. He returned to the life he knew, trapping, guiding, surviving. Glass continued working the frontier for another decade. He survived other close calls, other harsh winters, other nights sleeping rough in impossible conditions. In 1833 he was killed along with 2 companions in an attack by Arikara warriors near the Yellowstone River. He was around 50 years old. He'd outlasted most men who lived his kind of life by 20 years. But it's that winter of 1823, that impossible crawl, that defines him in history. Not because of the violence he survived, but because of the quiet persistence he demonstrated, night after night, choosing to rest despite having every reason to give up. Closing his eyes, wrapped in bear hide under cold stars, alone and broken, and yet waking to drag himself a little farther. Sleep, for Hugh Glass, was not comfort. It was not peace. It was simply the body's refusal to quit. And in that refusal, there's something almost beautiful, something that speaks to the frontier experience in its purest form. The determination to rest, to wake, to continue no matter what the night brings. In our warm beds, safe from predators and weather, it's almost impossible to comprehend what Glass endured. But perhaps as we drift toward our own rest tonight, we can carry with us the image of a man who slept in conditions that should have killed him and woke anyway. Who found rest in restlessness, who survived one impossible night after another, until finally those nights became days, and days became years, and his story became legend. The frontier demanded so much from those who crossed it. But perhaps the cruelest demand was this: that even in the midst of trauma and danger and cold that cut to the bone, the body still required sleep, still needed those hours of vulnerability and stillness. And somehow, against everything, people like Hugh Glass found ways to give their bodies that rest, brief, broken, insufficient, but enough. Always, barely enough. As we drift further into the winter night, let us turn from the known toward the edges of mystery. The frontier was a place where practical survival met ancient traditions, where European settlers encountered ways of living they didn't understand, and where the simple act of sleep became woven with folklore, dreams, and practices that blur the line between the physical and the spiritual. There are questions about winter sleep in the Wild West that have no clean answers. Fragments of diaries, archaeological findings in abandoned homesteads, stories passed down through generations. All of these hint at a sleep culture that was far stranger and more complex than simple exhaustion and cold blankets might suggest. Let us wander through these mysteries together, gently, as one might walk through a winter landscape where the familiar suddenly becomes strange in the moonlight. The teepee, an engineering marvel wrapped in spiritual practice. The Plains tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others, had been surviving winters in this landscape for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. They possessed knowledge that the newcomers desperately needed but often failed to fully learn, and much of that knowledge centered around the teepee, a structure so ingeniously designed for winter survival that it remains somewhat mysterious even today. A properly constructed teepee is not simply a tent, it's a carefully engineered environment that works with fire, wind, and temperature in ways that seem almost magical until you understand the physics involved. The conical shape sheds snow and wind with remarkable efficiency, preventing accumulation that could collapse the structure. The adjustable smoke flaps at the top create a Venturi effect, drawing smoke up and out while pulling fresh air in from the bottom. The liner, a second layer of hide, suspended inside, creates an insulating air pocket and directs cold drafts down and out beneath the edges. The construction itself was a feat of knowledge passed down through generations. The poles were cut at specific times of year from specific trees, treated in ways that made them both flexible and strong. The hides were tanned using methods that left them breathable yet weather-resistant. The whole structure could be assembled or dismantled in under an hour by a skilled family, Yet when properly erected, it could withstand winds that would flatten a settler's cabin. But here's where it becomes mysterious. Native peoples would sleep in these teepees through winter nights that regularly dropped below zero, and by many accounts, they slept well, better than the settlers in their log cabins. How? Archaeological work on historical teepee sites has revealed some answers. The positioning of the sleeping areas was precise, never directly beneath the smoke hole where cold air would fall, but along the back curve where the liner created the warmest pocket. Families would sleep on raised platforms of willow branches covered with buffalo robes, lifting them off the frozen ground. The fire in the center, carefully tended through the night, created a surprisingly even heat distribution that the conical shape amplified. The layering of sleeping materials followed principles that modern sleeping bag designers would recognize. Buffalo robes provided insulation that trapped air while wicking away moisture. The willow platforms allowed air circulation underneath, preventing the deadly cold that came from direct contact with frozen earth. Some accounts speak of 4 or 5 layers of hides and furs arranged in a specific order that maximized warmth while minimizing weight. But there's more to it than engineering. The anthropological record speaks of sleep rituals, of the songs sung before bedding down, of the careful orientation of beds according to cardinal directions. These weren't superstitions, or perhaps they were, but they were superstitions that encoded real survival knowledge. Sleeping with your head to the west, away from where the coldest winds came from, wasn't just tradition, it was practical. The evening routine itself was a carefully choreographed affair. As darkness fell, the fire would be built up and stones would be heated. These stones would be placed around the sleeping area, radiating warmth through the night. Children would be bundled first, placed in the warmest spots. Adults would arrange themselves around the perimeter, their bodies creating an additional windbreak for the young and elderly. And then there are the dream practices. Many plains cultures placed enormous spiritual significance on winter dreams. The long nights were seen as a time when the barrier between the physical and spirit worlds grew thin. People would prepare themselves for significant dreams by fasting, by prayer, by sleeping with sacred objects, medicine bundles, specific stones, feathers, placed beneath their heads or nearby. Young men would sometimes separate themselves from the main camp, sleeping alone in smaller structures or even out on the prairie, seeking vision dreams that would guide their lives. This practice was particularly common in winter, when the harshness of the environment was believed to strip away the superficial and reveal deeper truths. The question that haunts researchers is this: were these dreams purely spiritual experiences, or were they also affected by the physical conditions of winter sleep? The smoke from fires burned throughout the night, the reduced oxygen in sealed winter teepees, the mild hypoxia from sleeping at altitude in mountain winter camps, the nutritional deficiencies that set in as winter stores dwindled. All of these could produce altered states of consciousness, vivid dreams, even mild hallucinations. There are accounts in missionary journals and trader diaries of native people describing winter dreams of extraordinary vividness, dreams where they spoke with animals, traveled great distances, received prophecies. The Europeans often dismissed these as primitive superstition, but modern sleep researchers reading these same accounts recognize descriptions that sound very much like lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, and hypnagogic hallucinations. What if the winter sleep culture of the Plains tribes had, over generations, learned to work with the altered consciousness that harsh winter conditions naturally produced? What if their dream practices were a sophisticated response to environmental factors that European settlers simply endured as misery? The dreams were not just individual experiences, they were communal knowledge. A powerful dream would be shared with the tribe, interpreted by elders, sometimes acted upon. Dreams guided hunting strategies, warned of danger, determined the timing of ceremonies. In this way, sleep became not just rest, but a form of tribal intelligence gathering, a way of accessing knowledge that waking consciousness couldn't reach. We'll never know for certain. The knowledge was oral, passed through generations, and much of it was lost in the violence and disruption of colonization. But the mystery lingers in the archaeological record, in the stories that survived, in the peculiar fact that indigenous peoples seemed to sleep better in winter conditions that left settlers exhausted and half-mad from poor rest. The settlers' strange adaptations. Now let us turn to the settlers themselves and the odd practices that emerged as they tried to survive winters they were utterly unprepared for. In the ruins of sod houses across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, archaeologists have found a recurring artifact. Smooth river stones, often in groups of 4 to 6, positioned near where beds would have been. These stones show signs of repeated heating, discoloration, sometimes cracking from thermal stress. We know from diaries that heating stones in the fire and placing them in beds was common practice. But the mystery is in the specifics. Some stones have been found wrapped in fragments of cloth that shouldn't have been there. Silk, fine cotton, materials that were precious and rare on the frontier. Why wrap a heating stone in your best fabric? Some researchers believe it was about heat retention. The finer the weave, the better the insulation. Others suggest it was magical thinking, bringing something beautiful and associated with better times into the brutal reality of winter sleep. There's something deeply touching about these wrapped stones. Imagine a woman, her hands rough from frontier labor, carefully wrapping a heated rock in a silk scarf she brought from Boston or Philadelphia. The scarf might be the last nice thing she owns, the last reminder of a gentler life. And yet she uses it for this practical purpose, transforming a luxury item into a tool for survival. But perhaps it's more than practical. Perhaps the silk against her feet at night, even wrapped around a stone, helps her remember she was once someone who owned silk, someone who lived in a world where such things mattered. Even stranger, some stones have been found with scratched symbols on them, crude crosses, circles, sometimes what appear to be initials. Were these marks of ownership in communal sleeping spaces? Were they prayers literally carved into the tools of survival? We don't know. The people who made these marks left no written explanation, and their descendants often don't know the stories. One theory suggests these marked stones were passed between family members, each stone assigned to a particular person. In the darkness of a sod house, where you couldn't see what you were grabbing, the scratches would help you identify your stone by touch. But why the religious symbols? Why the elaborate patterns sometimes found? There's a ritualistic quality to these carvings that suggests they meant something beyond mere identification. There are also accounts found in journals, letters sent back east, of settlers burying themselves in straw for warmth, not just using straw mattresses, but actually burrowing into piles of straw, like animals hibernating. This practice appears most commonly in areas where settlers had arrived too late to properly construct shelters before winter hit, or where early storms destroyed the inadequate structures they'd managed to build. One woman's diary from Kansas, dated 1869, describes her family spending 2 weeks, living as the mice do, in a massive pile of prairie hay they'd gathered, with just a small opening for air and a carefully managed tiny fire. She writes of the strange dreams they all had, of how time seemed to become confused, of waking and not knowing if it was day or night. She writes of her children giggling in the darkness, treating it as an adventure, even as she was terrified they'd suffocate or burn. Her entries during those 2 weeks have a dreamlike quality themselves. She describes conversations she's not sure really happened. She writes about hearing music that couldn't have been there. At one point, she's convinced that several days have passed, only to learn from her husband that it's been less than a day. The sensory deprivation of being buried in straw, combined with the poor air quality and the constant low-level fear seems to have produced an altered state of consciousness. They survived. Many families in similar situations didn't, but we don't have their diaries. The mystery here is one of adaptation versus desperation. At what point does a survival strategy become something else, a new way of living that's neither European nor indigenous, but something born from the frontier itself? The settlers who buried themselves in straw weren't following advice from their farming traditions in Europe. They were improvising, trying anything, becoming something other than what they'd been. Death sleep nights. There's a phrase that appears in multiple frontier diaries and letters, always in reference to winter. Death sleep nights. The phrase is used without explanation, as if the writer assumes the reader will understand. But we don't, not fully. From context, these seem to have been nights of such extreme cold that sleep became dangerous, nights when the temperature dropped so low that not waking up became a real possibility. Some entries suggest that on these nights families would take turns staying awake, watching each other, making sure everyone kept breathing, checking for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. The preparations for a death-sleep night were elaborate. Every crack in the cabin would be stuffed with rags, cloth, even newspaper when available. The fire would be built up as high as safely possible. All the blankets, quilts, and spare clothing in the household would be piled on the sleeping family. Sometimes multiple families would crowd into one cabin, sharing body heat and resources. But other entries suggest something stranger. They speak of a quality to the sleep itself on these nights, a depth, a heaviness, a sense that those who slept were going somewhere far away. One Montana homesteader writes of his wife on a death-sleep night in January 1875. She sleeps so deep I must shake her hard to wake her. Her breath is slow. When she wakes, she speaks of walking in summer fields she knew as a child in Ohio. She is confused and thinks she is 8 years old again. It takes her time to return to herself. Ooh, this sounds like hypothermia, but it also sounds like something else. The way extreme cold can slow metabolism, can create a state that's almost hibernation-like in humans who aren't supposed to be capable of hibernation. The body, pushed to its limits, finding strange adaptations. There are accounts of people waking from death-sleep nights with no memory of the night at all, as if those hours had been erased from their minds. Others report dreams of such vividness that they seemed more real than waking life. Some speak of having experienced an entire lifetime in a single night, living through years of imagined experiences while their bodies lay frozen under piles of blankets. Medical journals from frontier doctors occasionally note cases of people who appeared dead from cold but were revived after hours of warming. The line between sleep and something more extreme became frighteningly thin in frontier winters, and the cultural response was this phrase, death sleep nights, acknowledging the danger while also normalizing it, making it just another part of winter survival. The phrase appears in letters sent back east, often causing alarm among recipients who didn't understand the frontier context. One woman wrote to her sister in New York, "We had 3 death-sleep nights last week." Her sister's panicked response, "Thank God you survived," seems to have confused the frontier woman, who replied with bemusement that of course they survived, everyone survived death-sleep nights, it was just winter. This disconnect reveals something important. The frontier was creating its own culture, its own language, its own normalization of experiences that would have been extraordinary anywhere else. Communal sleep in bunkhouses and camps. Then there are the communal sleeping practices that emerged in mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad construction sites. These weren't traditional communities, they were thrown-together collections of strangers, often men with no ties to each other beyond shared labor. And yet winter forced them into an intimacy that would have been unthinkable in other contexts. Bunkhouses were built for efficiency, not comfort. Long, narrow buildings with bunks stacked 2 or 3 high along the walls, a stove in the center, perhaps 1 or 2 windows. In the worst cold, 50 or more men might crowd into a space meant for 30 because body heat was precious and no one wanted to be in the smaller, colder, outlying buildings. The hierarchy of bunks was complex and often contentious. Top bunks were warmer but harder to reach and dangerous if you fell. Bottom bunks were easier to access but coldest, closest to the drafts that came under the door. Middle bunks were most desirable but also most likely to be near someone who snored or smelled particularly bad. New men got the worst spots. Seniority earned you better placement. Travelers' accounts described these spaces with a mix of horror and fascination. The smell was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, wet wool, tobacco smoke, the privy bucket that couldn't be emptied because the door was frozen shut. The sounds were constant: snoring, coughing, the restless movement of men who couldn't get comfortable. Arguments would break out over blanket theft, over someone taking more than their share of space. Violence in bunkhouses was common, but usually brief. A punch thrown, a wrestling match that ended quickly because neither man could afford to get seriously injured with winter still ahead. There were unspoken rules. You could complain, you could argue, but you didn't seriously hurt anyone because everyone's survival depended on everyone else staying functional. But something strange also happened in these spaces. A culture of sleep-watching emerged. Men would unconsciously synchronize their sleep patterns with their bunkmates. If one man had a nightmare and cried out, others would wake and wait to make sure he settled before sleeping again. If someone stopped snoring, always a bad sign, nearby men would reach out and shake them back to fuller breathing. There are accounts of men sleeping in shifts by agreement, some staying awake to tend the fire while others slept, then switching. But more interesting are the accounts of this happening without agreement, without discussion, the group unconsciously organizing itself for mutual survival. One railroad worker in Wyoming wrote about waking in the night and realizing that men were awake and keeping watch in a pattern, even though no one had discussed it. "It was as if we were one creature," he wrote, "one animal with many eyes, and some of those eyes were always open." Anthropologists call this communal vigilance, and it's seen in other high-stress survival situations. But it's particularly well documented in frontier winter camps. The mystery is how much of this was conscious cooperation, and how much was something more primal, humans reverting to an ancient way of sleeping that we mostly lost when we moved into individual shelters. Our distant ancestors didn't sleep alone in private bedrooms. They slept in groups around fires with predators in the darkness beyond. The frontier, in its way, recreated those conditions. And perhaps something very old in human sleep behavior reasserted itself. The bonds formed in these communal sleeping spaces were complex. Men who would never have associated with each other in normal life, different classes, different nationalities, different temperaments, became intimately connected through the shared vulnerability of sleep. You knew who snored, who had nightmares, who talked in their sleep, who wept quietly when they thought no one could hear. Some of these bonds lasted beyond winter. Men who shared a bunkhouse through a hard winter would seek each other out in later years, would trust each other in business dealings, would stand up for each other in disputes. The intimacy of winter sleep created relationships that transcended the usual social boundaries. The phenomenon of shared dreams. The winter dreams themselves deserve attention. Multiple sources, diaries, letters, even a few newspaper accounts, speak of people experiencing extraordinarily vivid dreams during frontier winters. Dreams so real that people woke confused about what was memory and what was imagined. Shared dreams where multiple people in the same cabin or bunkhouse would report dreaming similar things. A school teacher in Wyoming wrote in 1878 about a night when she and her 2 boarding students all dreamed of a woman in white walking across the snow. They compared their dreams in the morning and were disturbed to find the details matched. The woman's hair, her direction of travel, even the song she was humming. The teacher, educated and rational, tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but she was clearly shaken. She spent pages in her journal trying to rationalize what had happened, proposing and then discarding various explanations. Modern sleep science offers some explanations. The carbon monoxide from poorly ventilated fires can produce hallucinations and shared altered states. The malnutrition common in late winter reduces serotonin levels, affecting dream vividness. The social isolation and lack of external stimulation makes people hyper-focused on each other, possibly leading to unconscious suggestion and shared imagery. The science of shared sleeping spaces also suggests mechanisms. People in close proximity influence each other's sleep stages through sound and movement. If one person enters REM sleep and begins to move or make sounds, nearby sleepers may be triggered into REM sleep as well. If everyone is entering REM sleep at similar times, and if they've spent all day together with limited external input, it's not impossible that their dreams might have overlapping content. But there's also the possibility that these dreams served a function, that in the long, dark, isolated months of winter, dreams became a form of entertainment, of escape, of maintaining sanity. People would discuss their dreams in detail, building on each other's narratives, creating a shared imaginative life that made the harsh physical reality more bearable. Some frontier communities developed traditions around winter dream telling. In the morning, over breakfast, people would share what they'd dreamed. The best dreams, the strangest, the most vivid, the most comforting, would be retold and elaborated. By the end of winter, these dreams would have become almost mythological, stories that bound the community together. Children especially looked forward to dream-telling time. In a world where entertainment was scarce, where books were rare and expensive, where the same few stories had been told over and over, fresh dreams were a source of new narrative. Children would sometimes embellish their dreams, adding details to make them more interesting, and adults would go along with it, understanding that the truth of the dream mattered less than its ability to carry them through another day. This wasn't unique to the frontier. Many cultures have dream-sharing traditions, but there's something particular about how it manifested in the Wild West winter camps. The dreams took on qualities of the landscape, vast, empty, strange. People dreamed of walking through endless snow under impossible stars, of meeting wolves that spoke, of finding summer hidden in caves beneath the ice. There was a quality of longing in these shared dreams that's palpable even in the brief accounts that survive. People dreamed of warmth, of abundance, of home. But they also dreamed of beauty, of wonder, of the landscape itself, transformed into something magical. The prairie that was harsh and deadly in waking life became, in dreams, a place of mystery and possibility. Were these just dreams? Or were they a psychological adaptation, a way of surviving not just physically, but mentally through months of hardship? The mind creating beauty and mystery to balance the ugly reality of cold and hunger and fear. Archaeological mysteries. Archaeological sites continue to offer mysteries. In the remains of a Montana homestead from the 1870s, researchers found a sleeping alcove built into the cabin wall that shouldn't exist. It's too small for an adult, too carefully constructed to be an afterthought. The stones lining it show evidence of heating, and there are burn marks suggesting regular small fires. But it's positioned in a way that makes no sense for a child's bed. Too close to the ceiling, almost like a shelf. The alcove is barely 5 feet long and less than 3 feet wide. An adult would have to curl into a near-fetal position to fit. Yet it's lined with river stones that have been carefully mortared into place, a level of construction effort that seems excessive for such a small space. The burn marks suggest someone regularly built small fires inside this alcove, which seems incredibly dangerous given the confined space and proximity to wooden timbers. The current theory is that someone, likely a woman, based on artifacts found nearby, slept there. But why? The elevated position would have been warmer as heat rises. but it would also have been more dangerous, more exposed to smoke. It's a mystery of priorities, of what drove someone to construct this strange sleeping space. One possibility is claustrophobia reversed, that someone found comfort in the tight, womb-like space. Another is that someone was ill or injured and needed to be separated from the rest of the family but kept warm. A darker possibility is that it was a hiding place, somewhere to retreat from an abusive situation, though this is pure speculation. Similar oddities appear in other sites. Sleeping quarters dug into the ground beneath cabins, accessible only by ladder. Tiny enclosed spaces built inside larger rooms like boxes within boxes. Were these responses to specific conditions or signs of psychological stress manifesting in strange architecture? In one North Dakota site, archaeologists found what appeared to be a sleeping pit, a rectangular hole dug into the floor of a sod house, about 3 feet deep and just large enough for one person lying down. The walls of the pit were lined with prairie grass, and there were remnants of a wooden cover that could be pulled over the top. The person sleeping in this pit would have been below ground level, in complete darkness when covered, surrounded by earth on all sides. Why would someone construct and use such a space? The only explanation that makes sense is extreme cold. Being partially buried would have provided insulation, and the earth itself maintains a more stable temperature than air. But the psychological implications are troubling, choosing to be buried alive each night rather than face the cold above ground. We find the artifacts of sleep but struggle to understand the experience. The heated stones, the elevated alcoves, the shared bunks, the underground sleeping pits. They tell us people were desperately trying to survive winter nights. But the exact texture of that experience, the way it felt to be inside those moments, remains just out of reach. The weight of darkness. Perhaps the deepest mystery is how people mentally survived the darkness itself. Modern humans, accustomed to electric light, can barely imagine what true winter darkness meant on the frontier. From 4 or 5 in the afternoon until 7 or 8 in the morning, 15 hours of darkness, and you couldn't afford to burn candles or lamp oil for all those hours. So most of that time was spent in darkness, with only the dim glow of banked coals for light. What do you do with 15 hours of darkness night after night for 4 or 5 months? You can't read, you can't work, you can only talk for so long. So you sleep, but no one sleeps 15 hours a night even in winter. Historical sleep patterns before electric lighting were different from modern patterns. People would sleep in 2 phases, first sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. Frontier diaries suggest this pattern was common, perhaps even intensified by the long winter darkness. People would sleep for 3 or 4 hours, wake naturally around midnight, spend an hour or 2 in quiet wakefulness, praying, thinking, sometimes talking softly with others who were also awake, and then return to sleep until morning. This wasn't insomnia, it was normal, expected, even valued. The midnight waking was considered a peaceful, contemplative time. This biphasic sleep pattern appears across cultures and throughout history, but it was particularly pronounced on the frontier. The long darkness made it almost inevitable. You would fall asleep shortly after dark, exhausted from the day's labor, but 4 hours later you'd wake and there would still be 8 or 9 hours until dawn. Some people used this wakeful time for productive purposes. Women would do quiet handwork by feel, knitting, mending, their fingers so familiar with the work that they needed no light. Men would whittle, creating small wooden objects entirely by touch. Others would pray, reciting memorized prayers and hymns through the silent hours. But what were they thinking about during those wakeful hours in darkness? What does the human mind do with so much empty time? We can only guess from the few accounts that mention it. Some speak of planning for spring, running through mental lists of tasks. Others describe a meditative state, close to sleep but aware. Some write of prayer, of feeling close to God or spirits in the darkness. And some write of fear, of the oppressive weight of darkness, of feeling the cold and the night pressing in, of counting hours until dawn, fighting panic at how slowly time moved. There are accounts of people losing their minds in winter darkness. A Kansas settler wrote of a neighbor who began screaming in the night, convinced that the darkness was a living thing trying to suffocate him. A Wyoming diary mentions a woman who stopped speaking entirely for 3 months, only resuming normal conversation when spring arrived. The isolation and darkness and cold combined into something that broke people in ways that physical hardship alone couldn't. The mystery is how this shaped the people who experienced it. How did months of long darkness affect their minds, their dreams, their very sense of self? We know that seasonal affective disorder was surely common, though they had no name for it. We know from the elevated suicide rates in frontier winters that not everyone survived psychologically. But most people did survive. They endured the darkness, the cold, the terrible sleep, and they came out the other side when spring finally arrived. And then they did it again the next year and the year after that. Something in the human spirit is resilient enough to face this and not break. Or perhaps it did break people, but they learned to function while broken, to find small moments of rest and peace, even in circumstances that should have been unbearable. Spring awakening, and the cycle continues. When spring finally came, the change was dramatic. Diaries speak of people weeping with relief at the first warm day, of children running outside and refusing to come back in, of adults standing in sunshine with their faces turned upward like flowers, soaking in the light they'd been deprived of for so long. The sleep patterns would gradually normalize as the days lengthened. The shared dreams would fade. The intense bonds formed in winter bunkhouses would relax, though never completely disappear. People would move out of their cramped winter quarters, airing out blankets, dismantling the elaborate insulation systems they'd constructed. And then summer would come and go, and autumn would arrive, and the first cold nights would remind everyone that winter was approaching again. And they would begin the preparations once more, knowing what was coming, knowing what it would cost them. Yet they stayed, they endured, they adapted. The winter sleep culture of the frontier was born from necessity, but it became something more, a shared experience that bound people together, that tested them and changed them, that revealed both the fragility and the remarkable resilience of the human capacity to rest even in the most hostile conditions. Reflections on mystery. As we drift deeper into our own night, perhaps we can carry these mysteries with us. The heated stones wrapped in silk, the death-sleep nights, the shared dreams in crowded bunkhouses, the strange, sleeping alcoves that make no sense, the 15 hours of darkness and what people did with it. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're windows into human adaptability, into our capacity to create meaning and survival strategies in impossible circumstances. The frontier winter sleepers didn't just endure, they improvised, they adapted, they borrowed from indigenous wisdom and invented new practices and somehow, impossibly, found rest. Not comfortable rest, not peaceful rest, but enough rest to wake again, to continue, to survive another day and another night. And in that survival, in those stolen hours of sleep against all odds, there's something profound, a testament to the stubborn determination of human beings to rest, to dream, to close their eyes even in the coldest darkness. The heated stones speak of tenderness amid brutality, the care taken to wrap rough rocks in precious silk, the ritual of warming them in flames, the small comfort they provided through frozen nights. The death-sleep nights reveal our ancestors' clear-eyed acceptance of danger, their refusal to be paralyzed by fear, even as they acknowledged that sleep itself might be fatal. The shared dreams show us humans reaching for connection and meaning, even in the bleakest circumstances, building shared worlds of imagination when the physical world offered nothing but hardship. the strange, sleeping alcoves and underground pits, tell us that people were willing to try anything, to experiment with the most bizarre solutions, if there was even a chance they might provide warmth or rest. The 15 hours of darkness remind us that our ancestors lived in a sensory world completely foreign to our own, where natural rhythms dominated and artificial light was a rare luxury, not a constant presence. The mysteries remain soft and distant as snowfall. We'll never fully know what it was like, but perhaps, as we surrender to our own warm sleep tonight, we can honor those who slept in the cold and marvel at the fact that they did. They slept, and they woke, and they survived. Through months of darkness and cold that should have been unbearable, they found ways to rest their bodies and minds. They created practices and rituals around sleep that helped them endure. They shared warmth, shared dreams, shared the long dark hours. And when spring came, they had made it through another winter. That survival wasn't inevitable. Many people died, many more were permanently changed, damaged in ways that never fully healed. But the very fact that frontier communities persisted, that families returned year after year to face another winter, speaks to something remarkable in the human spirit. We are creatures who need rest, who must sleep even in impossible conditions, and we will find ways to do it no matter how strange or desperate those ways might be. The winter sleep culture of the Wild West frontier shows us this truth in its starkest form. Humans at the edge of survival, still closing their eyes, still dreaming, still hoping for dawn. As morning light finally breaks across the frozen landscape of our journey, let us turn our attention to a different kind of winter sleep, one experienced in relative warmth, in imported comfort, behind doors that locked and windows that held real glass. For while most frontier dwellers shivered through winter nights in drafty cabins and crowded bunkhouses, a small number enjoyed privileges that seemed almost obscene by comparison. Yet even their sleep was touched by the frontier's cold hand. Even wealth could not entirely insulate against winter in the Wild West. And in the contrast between their experience and that of the common sleeper, we find the full shape of frontier life, its inequalities, its fragilities, its strange moments where privilege dissolved and everyone became equally human against the cold. In Denver, in the winter of 1875, the newly constructed Brown Palace Hotel stood as a monument to civilization's conquest of the wilderness. Its grand opening had been delayed by weather. Early snows made construction impossible, but by December it welcomed its first guests to rooms that promised comfort unimaginable to those living just a few miles outside the city limits. The hotel's sleeping rooms were furnished with brass bedsteads shipped from Chicago, mattresses stuffed with genuine goose down rather than prairie straw, and quilts stitched by professional seamstresses rather than patched together from scraps. Each room had a fireplace with a damper that actually worked, controlling the flow of smoke and heat with precision that sod house dwellers could only dream of. The windows were double-paned glass, a luxury so extreme that guests would sometimes just stand and look through them, marveling at the clarity, the way they held back the wind without that constant whistling draft. But here's what the hotel advertisements didn't mention. Even in these fine rooms, sleep in a frontier winter was never quite secure. The fireplaces, for all their superiority, still required wood, and wood supplies could be interrupted by storms. The staff responsible for maintaining fires in guest rooms worked around the clock, but on the coldest nights they couldn't keep up. Guests would wake to find their breath fogging in the air, their water pitchers frozen solid, frost forming on the inside of those expensive windows. One guest, a railroad investor from Boston, wrote in his diary about waking at 3 a.m. to find his room cold as a tomb, the fire having died while he slept. He rang for service, another luxury, having someone to ring for. But the night staff was overwhelmed. Every room needed attention simultaneously. He waited an hour, wrapped in all the blankets from his bed and his overcoat besides, before a weary boy arrived with wood and coal to restart his fire. "I thought of the miners I'd seen that afternoon," he wrote, "sleeping in their crude shelters up in the mountains, and felt both ashamed of my complaints and grateful that I was not among them. Strange that we should all be in the same territory, yet living such different winters." This awareness, this peculiar consciousness of the divide, runs through many accounts of elite frontier sleep. The wealthy couldn't help but know what conditions were like beyond their comfortable walls. They saw it every day. Their servants came from those drafty cabins. Their coachmen slept in stables barely warmer than the outdoors. The gap between their sleep and the sleep of the common frontier dweller was visible, tangible, impossible to ignore. In Deadwood, during the gold rush years, a different kind of elite emerged, men who'd struck rich, suddenly and spectacularly, and who spent their newfound wealth in ways that revealed both imagination and desperation. One such man was Samuel Granger, who made his fortune in a claim he'd bought for nearly nothing from a discouraged prospector. Within 6 months, he'd built himself a house that locals called Granger's Folly, a 2-story structure with real wooden floors, plastered walls, and a bedroom on the 2nd floor with a cast-iron stove imported all the way from St. Louis. His bed was legendary. He'd commissioned it from a furniture maker in San Francisco and had it shipped in pieces up the Missouri River, then overland by wagon at extraordinary expense. It was mahogany with posts that reached nearly to the ceiling and a canopy of velvet curtains that could be drawn closed to create a warm, dark space within a space. The mattress was horsehair over springs, actual springs, not rope webbing, and he had sheets of Egyptian cotton and blankets of merino wool. By frontier standards, this bed was a palace. Men who saw it spoke of it in awed tones. To sleep in such luxury, in such warmth, in the middle of Deadwood winter, it seemed like something from a fairy tale. But Granger himself, in a letter to his sister back in Philadelphia, described his sleep as troubled. "The silence here is different than home," he wrote. "It is not peaceful silence, it is waiting silence. I lie in my fine bed and hear the wind and know it is trying to get in. The house creaks and settles. I think of the men sleeping rough in the gulches and feel strange about my comfort. Not guilty exactly, but strange, as if I am play-acting at civilization while the real world waits just outside." He also mentioned something else, that despite his warm room and fine bed, he often woke in the night and couldn't return to sleep. He'd light a lamp and read, or simply lie there thinking. The comfort, he suggested, was almost too much. His body didn't trust it. Some part of him remained alert, waiting for the cold to return, for the luxury to be revealed as temporary. This restlessness appears in other accounts from frontier elite. A kind of psychological inability to fully relax, even when physical conditions were favorable. As if sleeping too comfortably felt dangerous, like letting your guard down in enemy territory. The truly wealthy, the railroad barons, the big ranch owners, the territorial governors, often maintained 2 residences. They'd have their fine houses in growing cities like Denver, San Francisco, or even back east, but they'd also have frontier properties where business required their presence. And winter travel between these properties became its own peculiar ordeal, one where wealth provided options but not immunity. A woman named Caroline Mason, wife of a cattle baron who owned vast ranges in Wyoming, kept detailed journals of her winter travels between their Denver home and their ranch headquarters. The contrast between her sleeping arrangements night to night is almost comical in its extremity. In Denver, she slept in a 4-poster bed with a feather mattress, in a room heated by a modern coal furnace that piped warmth through metal registers. Her nightgowns were silk and flannel, her bedroom slippers lined with rabbit fur. She had a maid who would warm her sheets with a long-handled brass pan filled with coals before she retired. But when business called her husband north to the ranch, she accompanied him, and then she slept in stagecoach way stations, rough buildings where a dozen travelers might crowd into a single room, sharing beds with strangers, hoping the fleas wouldn't be too bad. She slept in hotel rooms in cattle towns where the walls were so thin she could hear conversations in adjacent rooms, and where the stove's heat was controlled by whoever woke first, not by her preference. She slept, on one memorable occasion, when a storm stranded their coach in the coach itself, pulled off the trail and half buried in snow, huddled with the other passengers under every blanket and coat they possessed. "I have slept in the finest hotels in New York and Paris," she wrote after that particular incident, "and I have slept in a frozen stagecoach listening to wolves. Sometimes these experiences are separated by mere weeks. This territory makes strange Democrats of us all, at least when it comes to winter." Her journals reveal something important. Wealth in the frontier context was precarious. It could buy you comfort, but that comfort was conditional, always at risk of being stripped away by weather, by travel, by the simple realities of distance and isolation. The elite could not entirely separate themselves from the frontier's harshness. They could only negotiate with it, finding moments of softness within larger patterns of difficulty. The social rituals around sleep among the frontier elite are fascinating in their own right. In established towns, as winter set in, the wealthy would gather for evening socials that extended late into the night. Dinners, card games, musical performances, in parlors warmed by stoves that consumed wood at prodigious rates. These gatherings were partly about entertainment and partly about defying the winter darkness, asserting that civilization could maintain its rhythms even here, even now. But they also had a practical function. Traveling home after such events through dark and cold streets was dangerous, so hosting families would often offer their guests the option to stay overnight. This created a peculiar intimacy, where social peers would suddenly find themselves sleeping in the same house, sometimes sharing rooms or even beds, in the old tradition of bundling that most had thought left behind in earlier centuries. A Denver socialite named Margaret Whitfield described in her correspondence the awkwardness of waking in a guest room to find frost on the windows and the fire long dead, then having to make her way downstairs in yesterday's evening dress to join her hosts for breakfast, everyone pretending that this situation was perfectly normal and dignified. "We maintain the forms," she wrote, "even when the conditions make them somewhat absurd. We dress for dinner even though we may all sleep in our clothes afterward. We use the good china even when the water is frozen and the washing must wait for spring. There is comfort in the rituals, I suppose, even when they serve no practical purpose." This performance of civilization, this insistence on maintaining standards even in conditions that made them difficult, was central to elite identity on the frontier. Sleep was part of that performance. You were supposed to retire at a respectable hour to maintain privacy and dignity, to wake refreshed and properly dressed. The fact that this was often impossible didn't stop people from trying. The architecture of elite sleeping spaces tells its own story. In the grand houses that survive from this era, the bedrooms are revealing. They're positioned on upper floors which should have made them warmer. Heat rises, but which also made them more exposed to wind. They have multiple windows which provided light and air, but also let in cold. They're often surprisingly small, these bedrooms, despite the house's overall grandeur. Why? Because smaller rooms were easier to heat. Even the wealthy understood this practical reality. You might have a large drawing room or dining hall for entertaining, but your bedroom, where you spent your most vulnerable hours, was kept compact. Many elite homes featured sleeping porches, enclosed but unheated spaces where people slept in the belief that cold, fresh air was healthier than warm, stale, indoor air. This was a fashionable health theory in the late 19th century, and the frontier's wealthy embraced it with enthusiasm, perhaps partly because it gave them a way to frame choosing to sleep in cold conditions as a sophisticated health choice rather than a necessity. One such sleeping porch survives in a mansion in Montana, now a museum. It's glassed in on 3 sides with a narrow bed and a small table. A placard explains that the lady of the house slept there year-round, believing it prevented consumption and promoted vitality. What the placard doesn't mention is that the bedroom immediately adjacent, with its large fireplace and heavy curtains, was also maintained and used by her husband. They slept separately, he in warmth, she in cold, each believing they'd made the correct choice for their health. Modern visitors often find this baffling, but it speaks to something important about how people understood sleep and health in that era. Comfort wasn't always the goal. Sometimes discomfort was sought, believed to be strengthening. The elite could afford to make these choices. The poor simply endured whatever conditions they had. Servants' quarters in elite frontier homes present their own sad contrast. While their employers slept in rooms with fireplaces and fine linens, domestic workers were housed in attics, basements, or separate outbuildings where winter conditions were barely better than the crude cabins of settlers. A cook named Mary Chen, who worked for a wealthy family in Sacramento but traveled with them to their summer ranch in the Sierra Nevada foothills, wrote letters to her sister in San Francisco describing the arrangements. The family's bedrooms had feather beds and wool blankets. The servants' quarters, a converted barn loft, had straw mattresses and whatever coverings each servant had brought with them. They do not think of us as feeling the cold the same as they do, she wrote, or perhaps they think of it but find it inconvenient to do anything about. I share a bed with 2 other girls for warmth. We sleep in all our clothes. In the morning, the water in the basin is frozen and we must warm it over a candle before we can wash. Then we go downstairs and serve them breakfast in the warm dining room, and they complain if the food is not hot enough. This matter-of-fact description of inequality runs through many servants' accounts. There's rarely anger in these writings, or if there is, it's muted, careful. More common is a kind of weary acceptance. This is how things are. The wealthy sleep warm, the poor sleep cold, and everyone knows it. But occasionally circumstances would create moments of forced equality. During severe blizzards, when keeping multiple fires going became impossible, households would sometimes consolidate, family and servants crowding into 1 or 2 rooms where a single large fire could be maintained. These emergency situations broke down social barriers in ways that were both necessary and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. A territorial judge's daughter described such a situation in her diary, a storm in 1882 that trapped their household for 5 days. "We all slept in the drawing room," she wrote, "our mattresses laid out on the floor around the great fireplace. Father and mother, my sisters and I, and also our cook, Mrs. Patterson, and our housemaid, Annie. The first night was strange beyond words. We did not know where to look or how to behave, but by the 3rd night we were simply human beings keeping each other alive, and the strangeness had worn away. I learned that Annie snores and that Mrs. Patterson prays aloud before sleeping, and these small intimacies would have been unthinkable before the storm. When the weather cleared and normal arrangements resumed, she noted that everyone seemed relieved to return to their proper places, yet something had shifted. I cannot see Annie now without remembering her lying beside us in the firelight. We are not the same as equals, but neither are we as separate as before. The children of the frontier elite had their own peculiar relationship with winter sleep. Many were sent east for education, spending winters in boarding schools where heating was better and conditions more predictable. But those who remained experienced a strange duality, comfort in their own homes mixed with awareness of the broader frontier reality. A boy named Thomas Everett, son of a mine owner in Colorado, wrote in a school composition about his winter nights. At home he had a bedroom to himself, a luxury most frontier children never knew. His father had installed a small stove in his room, and he had warm quilts and a feather pillow. But he also wrote about lying awake listening to the wind, thinking about the miners who worked his father's claims, knowing they slept in crude barracks up in the mountains. "I feel guilty for my warmth," he wrote with the directness of childhood, "but guilty enough to give it up. Does this make me a bad person? I do not know. Father says we have earned our comfort through hard work and risk, but I did not work or risk. I was simply born to it." This consciousness, this awareness of unearned privilege, threads through accounts from frontier elite children. They were raised to understand that their comfort was not universal, not guaranteed, not entirely deserved. And this shaped their sleep, adding a layer of psychological complexity to what should have been simple rest. As the frontier era progressed into the 1880s and 1890s, the gap between elite and common sleep experiences began to widen in some ways and narrow in others. Towns grew more established, infrastructure improved, hotels became more numerous and more standardized. The wealthy could increasingly insulate themselves from frontier hardships, but winter remained winter. The cold still came, storms still trapped people, and geography still enforced a kind of democracy. When you were caught on the trail between towns, your bank account couldn't summon shelter that didn't exist. There's a particular account that captures this beautifully. In 1888, a wealthy businessman named Robert Chandler was traveling from Cheyenne to Denver by private rail car, the ultimate frontier luxury, a fully appointed car with sleeping berths, a small stove, carpeting, and curtained windows. But a massive blizzard, later called the schoolchildren's blizzard, stranded his car on the tracks. The stove's coal ran out, the food supplies were limited, and for 3 days, Chandler and his companions, including his wife and their personal secretary, experienced what thousands of ordinary frontier people experienced all the time. His wife's diary from those days is striking. She describes the cold seeping in as the car's warmth dissipated, the way they huddled together under their fine blankets that were suddenly insufficient, the fear that the storm might never end, and then, after they were finally rescued, her strange reluctance to return to normal life. "I understand now," she wrote, "what it means to truly need warmth and shelter. Before this, comfort was just my natural state. Now I know it as something specific, something precious. I sleep differently now. I notice my bed's warmth. I'm grateful for the weight of blankets. Perhaps this is a gift from the storm, though a harsh teacher it was. The elite of the Wild West frontier never fully escaped winter's reach. They could build better walls, buy finer blankets, hire servants to tend their fires. But the cold remained. The isolation remained, the darkness remained, and sleep, for all of them, rich and poor alike, remained a fragile thing, a daily negotiation with forces that didn't care about wealth or status. In this, perhaps, there's a kind of equality after all. Not in comfort, the differences there were real and profound, but in vulnerability. Everyone who slept in the winter frontier was at some level defenseless. Everyone closed their eyes, not entirely certain of what morning would bring. Everyone listened to the wind and wondered if their shelter would hold. The wealthy had advantages, certainly, better odds of comfort and survival, but they didn't have certainty. No one did. And in that shared uncertainty, that common vulnerability, we find something almost tender, a reminder that some things level us all, that winter asks the same fundamental question of every sleeper: will you wake? Most did. Rich and poor, comfortable and suffering, they woke to another day. And in the simple fact of their waking, of their persistence through one more night, there's something worth honoring. The frontier asked much of those who settled it. But perhaps it asked most during the long winter nights, when all distinctions of wealth and status faded into the common human need for rest, for warmth, for the simple miracle of opening your eyes to morning light. And so we arrive, finally, at the end of our journey through the frozen nights of the Wild West. The fire in our imagined hearth has burned low. The darkness outside has perhaps softened toward dawn, or perhaps you've drifted through this entire story in the timeless space that exists between waking and sleep. Either way, it's time now to gather the threads of what we've seen and carry them gently toward rest. We began by asking what it meant to sleep when winter froze the frontier solid, when survival itself was uncertain and comfort was a luxury most could never afford. We walked through drafty cabins where breath turned to frost on the inside walls. We crawled with Hugh Glass across impossible distances, sleeping in bear hide under merciless stars. We touched the mysteries of shared dreams and death-sleep nights, of heated stones wrapped in precious fabric, of indigenous wisdom that understood what the newcomers were still learning. And we saw how even wealth could not entirely protect against winter's reach, how the cold found ways into even the finest bedrooms. What emerges from all these stories, all these fragments of the past, is something both simple and profound. People slept. Against all odds, through conditions that seem unimaginable to us now, they closed their eyes and surrendered to rest. Not because they were braver than we are, or stronger, or more resilient, but because they had no choice. The body demands sleep. Life requires rest. And so they found ways, however imperfect, however uncomfortable, to give themselves what they needed to continue. Think for a moment about the distance between their sleep and yours. You lie now, perhaps, in a room whose temperature is controlled by a thermostat, a device that would have seemed like pure magic to a frontier settler. Your walls are insulated, your windows sealed, your roof solid and waterproof. If you feel cold, you can adjust a dial or pull up an extra blanket from your closet, where you have more blankets than any frontier family owned in total. You are safe from wolves and weather. You are warm without effort. You can sleep without vigilance. This is no small thing. This is a victory so complete we barely notice it anymore. But it was won by those who came before, who endured the cold nights, who learned through bitter experience what worked and what didn't, who built better shelters and passed that knowledge forward, generation by generation, until warmth became ordinary instead of miraculous. The frontier sleepers didn't know they were part of this progression. They were simply trying to survive winter after winter. But their persistence, their refusal to give up even when sleep became a test of endurance, that created the foundation for everything that came after. There's a particular quality to winter sleep that we've traced throughout this journey. It's not the deep, peaceful rest of safety and comfort. It's something more fragile, more aware. The frontier sleepers never quite let go. Some part of them remained alert, listening for danger, monitoring their own bodies for signs of cold's encroachment. They slept lightly, woke frequently, drifted back under repeatedly through the long, dark hours. Modern sleep science tells us this is poor quality sleep. It's fragmented, insufficient for proper rest and healing, and yet they survived on it. Not just survived, they built towns, raised children, pursued dreams, created the framework of a society, all while sleeping poorly night after night, month after month. There's something almost heroic in this, though it wasn't meant to be heroic. It was simply what was required. The quiet, unheroic persistence of ordinary people doing what must be done. Closing their eyes despite the cold, breathing slowly despite their fear. Trusting that morning would come even when the night seemed endless. And morning always came. The sun always rose, pale and cold but present, breaking the darkness one more time. The frontier sleepers would wake, stiff, tired, still cold, and they would begin again. The rhythm of survival repeated endlessly, until eventually winter loosened its grip and spring returned. We cannot truly know what their experience felt like. We can read their words, examine their artifacts, reconstruct their shelters, and study their conditions. But the interior experience, what it felt like to be cold for so long that cold became your natural state, what it felt like to drift towards sleep uncertain if you'd wake, what dreams came in those circumstances and what they meant, this remains beyond our reach. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps some experiences belong entirely to those who lived them. We can honor the frontier sleepers without fully understanding them. We can acknowledge their struggle without appropriating it. We can be grateful for what they endured without romanticizing it. Because it wasn't romantic. It was cold and uncomfortable and frightening and exhausting. It damaged bodies and broke spirits and claimed lives. Not every winter sleeper woke in the spring. Not every family survived intact. The frontier was beautiful in many ways, but the winter nights were not among its beauties. They were its test, its cruelty, its way of separating those who could endure from those who could not. And yet people did endure. More than that, they found moments of warmth even in the cold, the comfort of another body sharing your blankets, the brief pleasure of heated stones wrapped in cloth, the satisfaction of banking a fire just right so it lasted through the night. The relief of waking to find everyone safe, everyone breathing, another night, survived. Small victories, but real ones. Enough to keep going. Enough to try again the next night and the next. As you drift now toward your own sleep, warm, safe, comfortable beyond the wildest dreams of any frontier settler, perhaps you can carry with you an awareness of this inheritance. The warmth you enjoy was not always available. The security you feel was not always certain. What seems ordinary to you was extraordinary to them, worth suffering for, worth building toward, worth all those cold nights endured in the hope that someday, somehow, it would get better. And it did get better. Slowly, incrementally, over generations. The cabins became houses, the houses gained insulation, the stoves improved, the understanding of how to build for cold climates deepened. Knowledge accumulated was shared, was refined. Each winter taught its lessons, and those lessons were not forgotten. You are the beneficiary of all that learning, all that suffering, all those nights when people refused to surrender to the cold. Your comfortable bed, your warm room, your peaceful sleep, these were built on a foundation of thousands of uncomfortable nights endured by people whose names we'll never know. This is worth remembering, not to make you feel guilty for your comfort, but to help you appreciate it fully. To sleep warm is a privilege, and like all privileges, it's made more meaningful by awareness of what came before. What? The frontier winter nights are long gone now. The last people who slept in those conditions, who truly knew what it meant to winter on the raw edge of settlement, have been dead for decades. Their cabins have collapsed into earth, their beds rotted away, their blankets dissolved into dust. The physical evidence of their sleep has mostly vanished, but something remains. In the accounts they left, in the stories passed down, in the simple fact that they survived, and we are here. Their experience echoes forward. We are connected to them through this most basic human need, the need to rest, to close our eyes, to surrender to sleep, even when circumstances suggest we should remain vigilant. They slept in the cold so that eventually someone, us, could sleep in warmth. They endured so that endurance would not always be necessary. They persisted so that persistence could one day give way to ease. This is their gift to us, unintended but real. And perhaps the best way to honor it is simply to sleep well. To let ourselves sink into comfortable rest without guilt, but with gratitude. To close our eyes knowing we are safe, and to remember, just for a moment before sleep takes us, that this safety was not always available. Outside your window, the world continues. Perhaps it's winter, where you are now, or perhaps summer. Perhaps you're falling asleep in darkness or in morning light. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you have shelter, you have warmth, you have the luxury of sleep that is restful rather than merely sufficient. The frontier sleepers would envy you this, but they would also be glad for you. They didn't endure those hard winters because they enjoyed suffering. They endured because they hoped for something better, for themselves if possible, for their children if not, for someone, someday. And here you are, the fulfillment of that hope, sleeping in the warmth they could only imagine. So sleep well tonight. Let yourself drift without resistance, without the vigilance that frontier nights demanded. Trust your walls to hold, your roof to remain solid, your warmth to last until morning. Trust that you will wake, that morning will come, that the cold cannot reach you here. And if you dream, perhaps you'll dream of winter, not the brutal winters of the Wild West, but a gentler winter seen from inside a warm room. Snow falling soft beyond the glass. Stars bright and cold but distant. The world beautiful because you are safe from it, comfortable because others were not. This is the gift of all those who slept in the cold, that we don't have to, that their endurance earned our ease, that the nights they suffered through have, finally, given way to nights of peace. The fire has died to embers now. The story is told. The long winter night of the frontier has passed into history, and we remain here, in our own time, with our own warm beds waiting. Rest well, knowing you are safe. Sleep deeply, honoring those who could not. And when you wake, as you will, as they did, morning after morning, perhaps you'll notice, just for a moment, how good it feels to wake warm. How miraculous it is to have survived the night without struggle. How far we've come from those frozen cabins and crude bedrolls under merciless stars. The frontier sleepers would tell you, if they could, sleep is a gift, warmth is a blessing, and the ability to close your eyes without fear is something to treasure every single night. So treasure it now. Let the weight of your blankets comfort you. Let the warmth of your room hold you. Let the darkness be peaceful rather than threatening. Let sleep come easy, as it rarely came to them. And drift now, gently, into rest. The winter nights of the Wild West are over. Your winter night, warm, safe, soft, is here. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let go. The cold cannot reach you now. Thank you for wandering through another quiet corner of history with me tonight. If this slow story brought you a little peace, feel free to subscribe. I share fresh, gentle stories almost each day. There's another calm tale waiting on the screen, or you can simply tap below to join our circle of nighttime historians. Sleep well until the next story.